As you know, the U.S. is sending high-powered military hardware to Ukraine. But what happens after it gets there? That is the concern, sources tell us. So far, the U.S. has sent more than $2.5 billion worth of military aid to Ukraine, including a new shipment that landed in the region just this week with helicopters, howitzer cannons, and military drones, among other things. CNN's Katie Bo-Lillis is following the developments for us. Katie Bo, is the worry that these weapons could potentially fall into the Russians' hands at some point?
Not exactly, Anna. According to our sources, the risk is a little bit more long-term than that. U.S. officials acknowledge that there is a possibility that at the close of this conflict, some of this free flow of arms could wind up on the black market and could end up in the hands of militaries and militias that the United States didn't intend to arm, similar to what has happened in past conflicts where the United States has armed one side or the other. But the reason for this, Anna, as you mentioned, is that the United States doesn't have a terribly reliable way to track what happens to these arms after they cross the border into Ukraine, what units they go to, how they're used. I want to read to you how one source briefed on the intelligence described this to us. This person said, "We have fidelity for a short time, but when it enters the fog of war, we have almost zero. It drops into a big black hole, and you have almost no sense of it at all after a short period of time." Now, there's a couple of reasons for why this is. One of them is that some of the arms, or many of the arms that the United States is sending, are smaller man-portable systems, things like shoulder-fired rockets and single-use drones that are easy to transport, and certainly far easier to transport and more difficult to track than things like large air defense systems like, for example, the S-300 that Slovakia sent. The other and perhaps most critical reason that these arms are difficult to track, Anna, is that the United States military is not in Ukraine. It's not embedded with the Ukrainian military, and therefore making it that much more difficult for the U.S. to keep a strict inventory of where these munitions are going and how they're being used. But at the end of the day, this is a calculated risk that the Biden administration has been willing to make. As one defense official told us, they view the risk of not adequately arming Ukraine as a much greater risk than the potential that in the long run, some of these arms might end up on the black market. Anna.
Katie Bo-Lillis, thank you for your reporting. Let's bring in Colonel Andrew Milburn. He is a retired Special Operations Commander in the U.S. Marine Corps who has now set up a military training center for Ukrainian troops, and he's joining us in Kyiv, Ukraine. Colonel, thanks for taking the time. Thank you for your efforts. How can the U.S. guarantee that the security assistance being sent to Ukraine doesn't end up in the wrong hands?
Anna, that's a great question. By the way, great pleasure to be here. Good evening to all of your listeners. And I'm going to answer your question. I'm just going to say how wonderfully circumspect and balanced the previous reporter was when she said that the means of ensuring that this stuff, logistics, supplies get into the front lines, and I'm paraphrasing here, is not terribly reliable. My guys here who are all former special operators from across all services, and we have got Brits here and various nationalities. They have a term for U.S. logistics supply within the country itself, and I'll just say the second word is show. But it's not a particularly complimentary term, and there's good reason for that. Okay, you know, you guys have hit on this. I would say that the very last concern that the United States government should have right now is that these arms end up in the wrong hands. All right, I mean they are ending up in the wrong hands, but through no malign intent. They are piling up in Lviv, all right, which is the western part of the country. People will get a mistaken impression that Lviv is near the front line because, you know, a few missiles hit the city the other day. But by and large, Lviv is remarkably secure for any part of Ukraine. And yet, when you go to Lviv, it's packed full of NGOs. There's hospitals. There are warehouses bulging with U.S. supplies. There are well kitted out troops. Because that's as far as it goes. You know, the bottom line is this: you lose control of logistics supply system unless you have your own guys manning the nodes. Again, not through any ill intent, but there's no one who's motivated or to get the stuff out of those warehouses through frontline units. Local commanders quite understandably want to take care of their guys. I would love in the back room here. I've got a commander who just came off the front line. He's going back there tomorrow. Actually, we're going with him. down to the southeast. It's just about a 6-hour drive. He is short of everything. He's a special operations command. He had six guys die 2 days ago in casualty collection points. They bled out through lack of tourniquets, lack of individual first aid kits, no trauma kits, lack of training, lack of equipment. And so it's a big joke to read in papers. Sorry, go ahead.
No, forgive me. I have so many questions for you, and I want to make sure that we get a chance to discuss a number of things. But to kind of just wrap up a little bit about this whole supply chain issue when it comes to the weapons, I know we've been reporting, and correct me if the reality on the ground is different, that there are challenges in getting equipment and aid of any sort, humanitarian aid, military aid, to the places that need it most because of Russian bombardments of those, supplies moving in different parts of Ukraine, hence why perhaps they're stuck in Lviv, which is a little bit safer and more secure for everybody who's in that country right now. I do want to ask, because of your experience as a former special ops commander for the U.S. and your role now in helping to train Ukrainian forces, what is the number one piece of equipment you need or they need right now?
Number one, drones. Okay, so unfortunately, very much a lot of publicity has been given in the news to the Turkish TB2 drone, which has performed magnificently here. But there's only a handful of those things, and they're kept at the drone command within the armed forces of Ukraine. Not a single unit that we have spoken to, actually with the exception of one, I'll talk about that, has anything other than the DJ-1 drone, which is Chinese manufactured, totally susceptible to geolocation of its user, totally vulnerable to Russian jamming interference, and frankly a piece of crap. We've just seen a handful, the first group of US-made drones make it to the front line, and they were hand-carried, and they're hand-carried by my guys. Who train units on the front line. That's, by the way, sorry, I should take a step back. I am, I suppose you call it CEO of a non-profit organization called the Mozart Group. And what we do here, we're not an NGO. We can't be an NGO because we train people, and training people includes training them to use weapons and kill people. But we do a lot of what we do is what you might call humanitarian. And drones are not, the drones we're delivering are not lethal weapons. They're used to, for what we call ISR, reconnaissance from their lines. As Ukrainians, as they transition into the offense, we hope, then they're going to increasingly need what we call Type 2 drones with longer range. They do not have them at all right now, except for these Chinese, the pieces of trash. So that's number one.
So is part of the issue that... Go ahead.
Yeah, so number two, medical gear. All right, there's and medical gear it's one of the favorites for non-government organizations. They're pouring it into the country. It does not get beyond Lviv. The guys on the front line are not just simply spouting. We have visited units that are short of medical equipment. I'm talking simple first aid kits. I'm talking trauma kits. As I mentioned, this case of a commander, in the kitchen behind me, losing guys in his casualty collection points is not unusual. It happens all the time. Everything from the point of injury to getting guys into hospital. Sadly, the casualty rates among Ukrainians are not publicized, but are much higher than they should be. And for those of us involved in this war and reading all this ridiculous attention to what the U.S. is doing, it's heartbreaking to hear the real stories.
Well, Colonel Andrew Milburn, thank you for sharing with us, shedding some light on what's happening and the efforts there to keep this fight going. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Anna.